Every family refused her because she carried a strange disease. A Doctor-Cowboy took the risk. The first thing I noticed about the Kimball girl wasn't the sores on her hands. It was the horse. She had a bay gelding, old as the hills and not worth $1 to anyone, and she had him hitched outside Dunnett's feed store with a slipknot so loose a stiff wind would have freed him. I was loading sacks of grain into my wagon. I watched her come out of the store with a small paper parcel tucked under one arm and not a word spoken to anyone behind her. The door didn't close right, and she didn't look back. She just untied the horse. The reins fell soft into her palms, and she stood there a moment with her forehead pressed against his jaw. Stood there like she was drawing something from him, or leaving something with him. I didn't look away fast enough, and she caught me watching. She didn't flinch, just looked back at me, brown eyes, steady, not embarrassed, and then she climbed up and rode south without hurrying. I asked old Dunnett about her. He wiped down his counter and said her name was Ada Kimball. She lived out past the Rennick Draw in a soddy that the Kimballs had given up on 12 years ago. He said she had something wrong with her skin, some kind of spreading sickness. He said no one in town would serve her directly anymore. She left coin on the post outside, and he left the parcel on the step. He said he didn't know what kind of a disease it was and didn't want to. I drove home thinking about the slipknot, about a woman who tied her horse that loosely. Either she trusted the animal completely, or she didn't care much whether it stayed. I was 44 years old that spring. I'd been a cattle doctor for going on 17 years, horses too, and every other creature men brought me. I'd come to this part of eastern Colorado from Missouri after my wife died, which was 9 years before this. I'd come out here because the land didn't know me, because not being known suited me fine. I had my place, a decent spread. I kept my own company. People came when they needed me and left when they didn't. That was the arrangement, and it was enough. I want to say I rode out to the Kimball soddy that first week because I was curious about the disease. That's partly true. Partly, I found the place on a Thursday when the sky was the color of pewter and the wind was coming out of the north with some real intention to it. The soddy sat low against a rise, a dugout really, with a barcan mud roof and a stack of firewood alongside the south wall that was better built than most of what I'd seen in the territory. Somebody had put care into that woodpile, log by log, tight and dry. The horse was out in a rough brush corral. He lifted his head at me. I called out from 20 yards off. You learn to do that in country like this. She came to the door and stood there in it, not stepping out, not stepping back. She had a canvas apron on and her hands were at her sides. The sores showed on both hands up past the wrists. Reddish, a little raised, in some places cracked. I'd seen similar once on a trapper up near Pueblo, but his had cleared with silver sulfate washes and careful wrapping. His had a cause. I couldn't say yet about hers. I told her my name and what I was. I told her I was a cattle doctor, but that I knew a fair amount about the human variety too, and had treated plenty of both. She said, I've heard of you. I said, and? She said, you kept the Rennick boy's leg. I had. Rennick's youngest had taken a horse kick to the shin 2 summers back, and I'd been the one there while Doc Harlan was 3 days out. I'd kept the leg. She watched me a while. The wind moved some loose hair across her face, and she didn't reach up to fix it. Then she said, well, come in then. The inside was clean. That was the first thing. Not fine, the walls were sod and the floor was packed earth and the roof was low enough I had to take my hat off or lose it, but clean in the way that takes real labor. A dry herb smell, something like sage but sweeter. A good iron stove. 2 books on a shelf, spines cracked and red hard. She had 1 cot and a table and a window that was greased paper, not glass, but the light it let in was soft and even. She sat across from me and put her hands on the table and let me look. I took my time. I asked her when it had started, where first, whether it spread and how fast. I asked whether she'd had fever with it. She answered everything straight and without self-pity. She said it had come on about 2 years back, beginning at the knuckles of both hands and moving slowly up. She said 3 families in town had sent word they couldn't have her near theirs anymore. She said the Harmons, who were her mother's people, who were supposed to be her people, had told her flat that she wasn't to come for Sunday supper. She said this without any particular expression. I asked if she'd seen a doctor. She said Doc Harlan had looked at her hands back at the start and said he didn't know what it was and suggested she go to Denver if she wanted a real answer. She said she couldn't get to Denver. She didn't say why and I didn't ask. I told her I'd need to come back, that I wanted to think on what I'd seen and do some reading, and that I'd bring some compounds and we'd try one thing at a time. She said, "You're not afraid of it." I said, "I've handled enough sick things to know that fear of them doesn't help them." Something shifted in her face, just a little. She picked up her hands from the table and set them in her lap. "Most people don't reason like that," she said. I said most people weren't cattle doctors. She almost smiled, not quite. I came back the following Tuesday with sulfur and lanolin paste, silver nitrate in dilution, and clean linen for wrapping. I'd spent the better part of Saturday night reading through the 2 medical texts I owned, and a veterinary compendium that had a section on skin afflictions I'd found more useful than either of the others. There was a condition described in the compendium, a fungal presentation in large livestock, that bore a resemblance to what I'd seen on Ada Kimball's hands. Not identical, but resemblant enough. I didn't tell her this. Not yet. A cattle doctor applying livestock medicine to a woman's hands required a certain amount of trust before it deserved explaining. She let me wash and examine and apply. She sat still for all of it. There was a steadiness to her that I noticed. She didn't flinch or pull away even when the silver nitrate stung, and it stung. I could tell from the way her jaw set briefly, but she kept her hands flat on the table and let me work. I came every Tuesday for 3 weeks. By the 4th week there was change, not dramatic. The cracking had eased at the knuckles, the redness was pulling back at the edges. She hadn't said anything about it, but I could see it, and she could too. The 5th Tuesday she had coffee made when I got there. She didn't make any ceremony of that either, just set the cup in front of me and sat down. I drank it and we talked about the range, about how the grass had come into the north, about the old soddy stove and whether the flue needed cleaning. Real talk, the kind you have with a neighbor. And she was smart, that was the thing. She'd read those 2 books hard. One of them was a natural history, dense with technical language, and she asked questions that showed she'd thought things through rather than just received them. By the time I rode home that evening, I had a feeling in my chest that I recognized and didn't entirely trust. 9 years since Clara, long enough that I'd stopped expecting to feel it again. Long enough that when it showed up it came in sideways, like light through a window you hadn't noticed was there. Now here is the part I'm less proud of. In late April, the 6th or 7th week of my visits, I was at Dunnett's picking up hinges and ran into Herschel Prewitt, who ran cattle on the flat south of town. Prewitt was a capable man, not mean, and he told me straight that people had noticed I was riding out to the Kimball soddy regular. He said it in the tone of a man doing me a service by mentioning it. He said Harlan had suggested, and the Harmons agreed, that it probably wasn't wise, for my practice, he said, for my standing, to be associated with her condition given that nobody knew the nature of it. He said this with his face set like he was delivering something I'd want to hear. I set down my hinges, and I said that I was a doctor, and that treating a sick woman was exactly what a doctor did, and that my standing in this community was my own concern, and not Harlan's or the Harmons or his. He took that in and said all right, he was just passing it along. I loaded my wagon and drove home and sat with it. I want to be honest here, I sat with it longer than I should have. Not because I was afraid of the opinion, I wasn't. I'd come out here partly to be shed of opinion, but because I had to look at what was underneath. I had to ask myself whether I was treating Ada Kimball because she needed treating or because of that feeling in my chest. The true answer was both. And then I had to decide whether the both of it changed anything. It didn't change the treatment. The sores were responding. There was nothing dangerous in the compound I was using and nothing dangerous in the condition as best I could determine. What I was doing was sound medicine. The other part, the feeling, the Tuesday coffee, the way I thought about her between visits, that was something I hadn't elected and couldn't unelect. All I could do was not act on it dishonestly. Not let it distort the medicine. Not let her feel obligated to something when she was in a position of needing care. I resolved to be careful. I was not always successful. One Tuesday in May, she asked me about Clara. She said, "You were married." I said yes. She said she died. I said yes. She was wrapping her own hands by then. She'd learned it, wanted the autonomy of it, and she didn't look up from what she was doing when she said, "I'm sorry. People talk about loss like it's a wound that closes. I think for some people it doesn't close, it just changes its nature over time. I said that was exactly right. She said her mother had died when she was 15. She said there were days when she still went to say something to her and had to remember. We sat with that a while. I said, "You've been alone out here 2 years." She said, "More or less." She tied off the last wrap and looked at her hands and then at me. Not with want, not then, just with attention. The kind a person gives you when they've decided you're worth it. "You're alone too," she said. "Aren't you not the same way, but alone?" I said that was also right. She nodded once, like we'd settled something. The Harmon business came in early June. Ada's uncle, Warren Harmon, a church-going man who ran the dry goods near the mill, sent word out to the soddy by way of the Prewitt boy, who couldn't have been more than 12 and looked sorry about it. The message was that if I continued to visit Ada Kimball, he would speak to the county health office in Pueblo about the nature of her condition, and whether she ought to be required to vacate her property and relocate somewhere where the public could not be put at risk. The boy delivered this at her door while I was inside. I heard it through the greased paper window. I came outside. The Prewitt boy was already edging his horse back. I asked him his name, and he told me. I told him to tell Mr. Harmon that I had examined Ada Kimball's condition thoroughly, that it was a fungal presentation of the skin with no demonstrated risk of transmission by ordinary contact, that there was no medical or legal basis for forced relocation, and that if he brought a health office inquiry, I would attend it personally, present my findings, and also ask some questions about how a man who hadn't practiced medicine for 30 years had arrived at his determination. The boy nodded with very wide eyes and rode off fast. I turned around, and Ada was standing in the doorway. I expected she'd say thank you, or be flustered, or apologize for her family's behavior. She did none of those things. She said, "Did you mean all that, about the transmission?" I said yes. I said I was as certain as I could be given what I knew. She said, "I've been afraid for 2 years that I was a danger to people, that the families were right to keep their distance." I said the families were wrong. I said there was a lot of fear in small places about things people didn't understand, and that fear made people cruel and called it caution. She looked at me then like something had come off her, not the sickness was almost gone, but something heavier. She looked lighter in the shoulders, easier in the jaw. She said, "Come inside, I've got beans on." That was all, "Come inside, I've got beans on." But the way she said it, like I was someone who belonged there, like there was a place set that was mine, I felt it in my ribs. The county health office in Pueblo sent a letter. I replied with 4 pages of clinical documentation. I never heard back. Warren Harmon stopped speaking to me at church. I didn't go to that church much anyway. By July, the sores were nearly healed. A slight discoloration at the wrist still, there was scarring that would stay. I'd been honest with her about that. But the cracking and the redness were gone, and her hands moved freely. She came to my place for the first time in the first week of August to tell me. She rode up on the old bay gelding and tied him with that same loose slip knot at my gate post, and came to the porch where I was shelling peas, and told me her hands were clear. She held them out as evidence. I looked at them. I turned them over once and looked at the palms. The skin was new-looking at the knuckles, a little smoother than the surrounding skin. I said, "You did the washing and wrapping the same way every day?" She said, "Yes, every day, same as I showed her." I said that was what had made the difference. She said, "You're the one who figured it out." I said I'd had help from a veterinary compendium. She looked at me then. There was something in her face that was direct and considered. She always had that. She didn't come sideways at things, and she said, "I want to say something to you, and I don't want you to take it the wrong way." I set down the peas. She said, "You came out there when no one else would. You weren't trying to prove anything, and you weren't trying to be admired for it. You just came, and you kept coming. And every time you came, you treated me like a person who deserved a real answer." She paused. The bay gelding shifted at the gate. "I know what that cost you in this town," she said. "I've heard it, and I want you to know that I know it, that it meant something to me that can't be put back into a smaller thing." I didn't say anything right away. There was a cottonwood tree at the corner of the yard that was moving in a slow, hot August wind, and I watched it a moment. I said I didn't come because it was noble. She said, "I know that too." We looked at each other. I said I'd like to keep coming out to see you. Not as your doctor, you don't need a doctor anymore. She stood on the porch step one step below me, which put her eyes level with my chin. She reached up and put one hand, the right hand, the noose-kinned knuckles, against the side of my face and kept it there, warm and steady, like she was taking a reading. "I'd like that," she said. "I'd like that very much." I put my hand over hers and held it there. The cottonwood moved. The bay shifted his feet at the post. We didn't make it quick or dramatic. That wasn't her way or mine. She took her time deciding things, and so did I. And by September, we'd both decided. And by October, she'd moved out of the Saudi and into my place, and we'd been married at the county clerk's in Pueblo with nobody present but the clerk and a man who came in to buy a land title and agreed to stand as witness. The Harmons sent nothing. Dunnett shook my hand at the feed store the following week and said he was glad for us, which I believed. What I want to say about Ada, what I want to leave with you here, the real thing, the part that still catches me when I think about it, is this. She chose me with open eyes. She knew what I was. She knew I wasn't young and I wasn't a rancher with prospects, and I wasn't the kind of man who filled a room up with his presence or made women turn their heads on a street. She knew I was a quiet man who worked with animals and read veterinary compendia and had been alone for 9 years. She knew all that, and she chose it. Not because she had to. Her hands were healed. Her situation had changed. She could have ridden back south and rebuilt things and maybe found a different arrangement in time. She had her own grit, her own will, her own way of meeting the world head-on. She didn't need saving. She chose me because she wanted to. There's a difference between being the thing that someone settles for and being the thing that someone chooses when they could choose otherwise. I know that difference. I'd been on the wrong side of it long enough to know it from the inside. She is the right side. I'm 61 now. She's a few years younger. We've been on this place 17 years. She took over the record-keeping for the practice early on. Turns out she had a mind for it, for dosages and case notes and billing. And there are people in this part of the county who know her better than they know me, and that suits me fine. She grows things in the kitchen garden. She still has the old bay gelding, who is ancient beyond reason and eats better than he deserves. There are mornings, this time of year especially, when the light comes in early and flat across the yard, that I wake up and I can hear her in the next room doing whatever she's doing, and I just lie there a minute and feel the weight of it. Not a heavy weight, the other kind. The kind you've been carrying so long it feels like part of you. I was 44 years old and a cattle doctor and a widower and alone. I rode out to a Saudi in the draw because a woman tied her horse with a slipknot and pressed her forehead against his jaw. I was the one they said would lose his standing. I was the one they warned off. I didn't lose a thing. I found the one thing I didn't know I was still looking for.